Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. If you are an 8th grader studying South Carolina history, you probably think you know the map of our state pretty well by now. But today, we're going way back. We're talking about a time when maps were basically pure guesswork, survival meant making incredibly dangerous alliances, and deer hides were literally worth their weight in gold.
I want you to picture this for a second. Imagine stepping off a wooden boat onto the marshy shores of Charlestown in the year 1670. You are stepping into a completely unknown world. There's no Google Maps, there's no satellite imagery, and honestly, the early English settlers were completely clueless. They had almost no idea what was waiting for them just a few miles inland, let alone all the way up to the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Just take a look at this early English map from 1671. It perfectly captures how utterly confused they were. It was published by a guy named John Ogilby, and if you live in South Carolina today, this probably looks ridiculous to you. He drew in these massive, completely imaginary lakes that literally do not exist, and even worse, he completely left out the most crucial river systems, like the Santee and the Wateree, which is exactly where thousands of Native Americans actually lived. The mapmaker just basically copied native towns from old Spanish maps that were already like 100 years out of date.
And this gets to the heart of a massive misunderstanding. See, the English were totally obsessed with drawing static, invisible borders and plotting little isolated dots to represent towns. But Native Americans viewed their world in a completely different way. They didn't see isolated dots at all. They saw this huge, living, expansive network. Their entire worldview was based on interconnected rivers and trading paths that linked communities together across hundreds of miles.
All right, moving into our next section, the Great Deerskin Boom. Because once the English finally figured out how to use those native trading paths, it sparked an absolute economic explosion.
150,000. Let that sink in. That is the staggering number of deerskins that were being shipped out of Charlestown every single year by the mid-1700s. Why so many? Well, over in London, fashion was changing. A new kind of leather hat became super trendy right around the time a massive cattle plague in Europe made cow leather incredibly scarce. So overnight, South Carolina's white-tailed deer became the absolute most valuable thing in the colony, long before anyone was getting rich off rice or indigo.
Okay, let's do some quick math here because these numbers are wild. When you look at the going rate for prime deerskins or beaver pelts back then, it was about 16.96 shillings a pelt. If you translate that into today's money, where a colonial shilling is worth about 46.56, you are looking at nearly $800 for one single animal skin.
I mean, ask yourself, would you drop $800 today on a leather hat or some gloves? Probably not. But for the early colonists and traders, this wasn't about going shopping. This was the ultimate side hustle. It was their fastest ticket to massive, life-changing wealth. The woods of South Carolina were basically paved with gold as long as you were willing to go out and hunt or trade for it.
So, to get their hands on those insanely valuable skins, the colonists relied on pioneering English traders. Enter guys like Henry Woodward. He was actually smart enough to sit down and learn the native languages. He became one of the very first Europeans to trek the entire length of the Great Catawba trading path, striking these super lucrative deals with native tribes deep in the interior of the state.
But remember, trade is a two-way street. The Native Americans definitely wanted European goods, especially firearms. For native hunters, a prized European trade musket cost exactly 35 deerskins. That was a huge upfront investment, for sure. But think about the payoff. With that musket, a single hunter could easily take down 30 deer in just one season. It was a total game changer that completely revolutionized how Native Americans hunted and shifted their whole economy.
So, that brings us to Section 3, the Catawba's countermap. As this massive trade network blew up, Native Americans realized the English were still completely lost when it came to local geography and politics, so they decided it was time to school them. But before we look at the map they made, we need to lock down a crucial vocab term for your class: coalescent societies. Look, when European diseases like smallpox hit and the horrific Indian slave trade ramped up, the old massive Mississippian chiefdoms completely collapsed. To survive that absolute chaos, refugees from all different groups banded together. They coalesced into new autonomous river towns. The Catawba Nation is a prime example of this kind of incredible survival strategy. Okay, now check this out. This is the famous Catawba deerskin map from around 1721. A native leader, known as a cacique, painted this and actually presented it directly to the royal governor of South Carolina, Francis Nicholson. And notice what's missing. It completely ditches physical geography. No mountains, no coastlines. It's a map of relationships. The native towns are drawn as abstract circles. The European towns, like Charlestown and Virginia, are squares, and they're all linked together by these double lines that represent paths of peace and alliance. And right there in the center, the primary Catawba town of Nassau. Historians love to call this map a didactic response to English cartography. But in 8th grade terms, this was the ultimate 18th century clapback. It was specifically designed to correct English ignorance. The Catawba were looking the governor in the eye and saying, look, this is who we really are. We are this massive, interconnected network of towns, and we sit at the very center of the southeastern trade. You have to deal with us.
All right, moving into Section 4, the Suez Tragic Voyage. Because, as much as this transatlantic trade built wealth and alliances for some, it wasn't a win for everyone. For the coastal Sawi tribe, it led to an absolute nightmare.
See, the Sawi lived right around modern-day Moncks Corner and the Santee River. They were heavily involved in the deerskin trade, but they quickly realized they were getting totally ripped off by the English middlemen in Charlestown. So they came up with a brilliant but ultimately tragic plan to cut them out. They built this massive fleet of canoes, equipped them with woven mat sails, loaded them up with hides, and literally tried to row directly to England. They aimed for the exact spot on the horizon where English ships always appeared. But out on the open ocean, a catastrophic storm hit and just destroyed the fleet. The survivors were actually rescued by a passing English ship, only to be cruelly betrayed and sold into slavery down in the West Indies.
It's just a heartbreaking story. Ultimately, the fallout from the deerskin trade completely shattered the Sawi. The very few who had stayed behind on land, mostly the young, the sick, and the elderly, just couldn't sustain the tribe anymore. They were forced to merge with the neighboring Wando people just to survive.
Which brings us to our final section, the cost of the trade. We've talked about the insane wealth this generated, but we have to zoom out and look at the massive, permanent scars this whole era left on South Carolina.
The relentless demand for leather completely upended Native American life. I mean, the white-tailed deer population was just rapidly wiped out across the Southeast. And because Native Americans were now hunting strictly for commercial trade, they had to drop a lot of their traditional practices. They became entirely reliant on the European economy just to get basic goods. That desperation directly led to increased intertribal raids to capture slaves to sell to the English, which eventually ignited horrific, devastating conflicts like the Yamasee War in 1715.
And the environment took a massive hit too. The natural world of South Carolina was permanently changed by European settlement and all this rapid commercial expansion. Beautiful unique species like the Carolina parakeet, which was actually the only parrot native to the eastern U.S. and used to fill the skies over Charlestown, were driven completely to extinction.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one mind-blowing fact. You know the main overland trail the Catawba used to bring all those deerskins down to the coast? It was called the Broad Path. Well, when that path entered the Charlestown grid, the colonists renamed it King Street. That's right, the exact same King Street where you might go shopping, eating, or driving today in modern Charleston was carved out centuries ago by Native Americans trading deerskins. So the next time you're traveling across South Carolina, ask yourself, what other hidden history are you stepping on right now? Keep digging, keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.